Hi, the SI meteorologist Paul Dorian here with a brief discussion about an atmospheric phenomenon known as stratospheric warming. We often talk about teleconnections in the atmosphere here at the SIweather.com, where weather events over one part of the world can have an effect on another part of the world. Well, who would believe it, but what happens over the North Pole can have significant ramifications on the temperature pattern here in the United States during the wintertime through an atmospheric phenomenon known as stratospheric warming. The normal circumstance in the wintertime is for a polar vortex to exist right on top of the North Pole in the stratosphere around 10 millibars or so. Every once in a while, this cold, low-pressure area weakens or even reverses and becomes a high-pressure area, and that often sends off a chain of events that will lead to a major temperature pattern change here in the United States several weeks later. Well, that's what we'll talk about over the next few minutes, this stratospheric warming atmospheric phenomenon. Again, it takes place over the North Pole, where normally a polar vortex exists at around 10 millibars or so, and every once in a while it weakens or even reverses and becomes a high-pressure area. And this process is accompanied by a rise in the stratospheric temperatures, hence the name of stratospheric warming given to this atmospheric phenomenon. Now, several weeks later, after this warming occurs, studies have shown and experience has shown that there have been major temperature pattern flips here in the United States from this change in the overall weather situation at the highest levels over the North Pole. In fact, what typically happens if there's a change from a cold polar vortex to a weaker polar vortex, or a displacement of the vortex, or even a reversal to high pressure, can often lead to a blocking pattern in the upper atmosphere over the Arctic. And this can be reflected in the North Atlantic Oscillation Index that we talked about here at the SIweather.com in another video on the Meteorology 101 section. What has been found in some instances of this atmospheric phenomenon known as stratospheric warming is that anywhere from 10 to 14 days or so after the event actually takes place, there can be that major temperature flip. And in fact, there have been a couple of major stratospheric warming events that we'll talk about over the next few minutes. And the whole process for those events actually took several weeks, from around November in those particular circumstances to about January before the temperature change actually occurred here in the United States. So one such event took place between December 1984 and January 1985. Another example is from 1998 to 1999. And then finally, we'll take a look at the current situation here in December 2011, see what the possibilities are, if there are any possibilities of a stratospheric warming event to take place over the next several weeks. Well, let's kind of walk through a couple of these example events that have occurred, one in the 80s and one in the late 90s. This particular one, the first one we'll look at, took place in 1984, spilled over into 1985. And there's a couple things I want to point out. First of all, what we're looking at here is the overall temperature composite anomaly in the highest levels of the atmosphere, the stratosphere, at around 10 millibars. And this is the difference from normal. And here's the North Pole right here. And as is normally the case, we have colder than normal, represented here by the blues and purples, sitting over the North Pole. But notice there is a warm splotch of air here at this particular time, just on the other side of the pole, on the Asian side of the pole. Now, take note of the timetable here, because that's an important feature I want to point out here. This is in November, the early to middle part of November. This is actually for that entire week, the temperature composite anomaly. Now, let's take a look a couple of weeks later. Well, here now you see early part of December, and notice what happened to that cold vortex. It disappeared, and here is a very warm area that's headed right for the North Pole region. In other words, there's been quite a flip in this time, only a couple of weeks. Let's go back again. This is the early mid part of November, and now we're moving on to the early part of December. Now let's jump ahead again, and here's a couple of weeks later in the latter part of December, the last week of December 1984. So we went from this to this to this over about a month and a half time period. Quite a change in the upper part of the atmosphere in terms of air temperature. Now, just a couple of weeks after that, let's take a look at the U.S. temperature anomaly. Now, here we go. This is in January of 1985. So again, this whole timetable for this particular event started in early to mid-November, and now we're looking at a temperature flip in the month of January. So the whole thing took several weeks, and this is actually the surface temperature composite anomaly. So this is colder than normal throughout the entire country. Many of you may remember the bitter cold outbreak that occurred just a week or two after this on January 20th, 1985. It happened to be the second inauguration for Ronald Reagan, and it was so cold in the Washington, D.C. area that they just canceled all outdoor activities on January 20th. So again, this particular stratospheric warming event started in the early to mid part of November, and the temperature change in the U.S. actually was not really in evidence until January. It took several weeks. Now let's take a look at another example. Well, this second example of a major stratospheric warming event took place in late 1998 and spilled over into the early part of 1999. Again, as with that last setup in 1984 to 1985, it was colder than normal over the North Pole. In this particular case, it was colder than normal in the upper part of the atmosphere over a huge part of the globe. Now, take a look and see what happens here. Again, just a few weeks later, and the pattern begins to flip again. Again, we get this changeover from much colder than normal here on the Siberian side of the pole to warmer than normal. And sure enough, this is headed on towards the North Pole. Again, this is now the timetable I want to point out is important here. This is early part of December. So we go from here in the latter part of November to something that looks like this in the stratosphere in terms of temperature composite anomalies a few weeks later. And then finally, here by the middle part of December, look at this, a complete flip over the North Pole. This is a true flip in about a month's time over the North Pole from the typical cold polar vortex to much above normal, associated with the rise in stratospheric temperatures. Now let's take a look at what kind of effect it had on the U.S. temperatures. And here we go to the surface temperature anomaly in the early part of January 1999. Much, much colder than normal here throughout the central and eastern part of the country. So again, this particular stratospheric warming event took many, many weeks from the beginning signs of the changeover at the North Pole to the time it actually flipped the temperature pattern here in the U.S. Again, from November to January. So those are a couple things I want to point out, that this can be a several-week evolution from the time the warming actually begins over the North Pole in the stratosphere. Well, what about this particular year? Here we are in December of 2011, and is there a possibility of a stratospheric warming event to occur over the next 6 to 8 weeks or so that could change our temperatures? We've been very mild here in a good part of the U.S. over the last several weeks, well above normal here in the month of December. Can there be a stratospheric warming event? Well, this is the latest look at the upper part of the atmosphere, 10 millibars of stratosphere, the temperature analysis pattern. North Pole Center right here, and there is a polar vortex right nearby, just near the pole here, not quite over the pole, but not too far away. Now, there are models out there that NCEP runs that could predict the stratospheric temperature pattern up to 10 days or so in advance. And here we'll take a look at what happens here in this particular circumstance. There's 10 days later, and that shifts the polar vortex somewhat onto the Asian side of the pole. Again, it goes from about here, and then in about 10 days to about here. So there are some indications of a possible stratospheric warming event to occur. The details are not ironed out yet, and it's still just have to wait and see how things evolve over the next couple of weeks. And again, this is something that we'll monitor here at the siweather.com, because a stratospheric warming event that takes place over the North Pole can have a pattern flip here in the U.S. several weeks later. So we'll monitor that over the next couple of weeks. And that's it for now. That was a brief discussion on stratospheric warming. I'm the SI meteorologist, Paul Dorian.